how many need to die in that atrocious way for you to start doing your job?
They no longer believe in a system of international legality.
The 500 villages that were destroyed.
An ongoing Nakba.
I was an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and I woke up screaming.
I'm Naomi Klein, and today we're going to get unshocked about Israel's ongoing and escalating genocide in Gaza. When Western politicians and pro-Israel journalists are asked about Israel's attacks on Gaza, they still tend to start by talking about October 7th, 2023, as if that's the day when it all began, with Hamas's attacks that included attacks on civilians that are crimes of war. But Israel's campaign of unrelenting terror in Gaza, the repeated forced displacements, the starvation, the maiming and massacring of civilians, including staggering numbers of children, was not born of one single event. As Palestinian foreign policy analyst Rula Jebreal lays out in her new book, Genocide, What is Left of Us in the Neo-Imperial Era, all of this is actually an extension of Israel's decades-long effort to erase the Palestinian people, an ongoing Nakba. Drawing on her own family history in Palestine, she reminds us that this story begins decades ago, when Zionist militias forced Palestinians out of their homes into a system of brutal oppression, segregation, and forced exile. The actions of Israel's military are part of this, but so too are Israel's attacks on international law, its relentless smearing of its critics, from the highest UN officials to random undergraduate students. And she reminds us that none of this would be possible without the systemic dehumanization of Palestinians in the Western media and seemingly limitless US assistance, most recently taking the form of Donald Trump's plan to quote unquote clean out Gaza, but hardly beginning there. It is an extraordinary book, drawing on Rula's remarkable childhood growing up in a Jerusalem orphanage and the many ways that experience has inspired a lifelong connection and commitment to children who are trapped in violent events they had no hand in creating. Rula also draws on her many years as a war correspondent and as a scholar teaching the core principles of international humanitarian law. Rula Jebreal is also a Zeteo contributor, a dear friend, and I am so happy and honored to have her on Unshocked today to talk about her new book and help us understand what is at stake in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. Rula, congratulations on this book, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Naomi.
So Rula, you wrote the book in Italian. It's one of the many languages in which you are fluent, and it's come out in Italy first. Now, normally we would wait for the English translation to be published, and that is coming before having this conversation. But your book is such a crucial intervention, and it has such an important message for this moment. So we didn't want to waste any time. It's already sparking a major political response in Europe. Not only is it already a bestseller, congratulations again, but it comes in a moment when it feels like parts of Europe may finally be ready to push back on Israel's impunity. This past week, you presented the book in Italy's Senate. So I want to start by asking you to tell us what that experience was like and what it's been like launching this book called Genocide in a moment like this. Is something shifting?
Yes, absolutely yes. And I decided to write this book in Italian, but this book in my heart and in my brain started by joining all my identities. So I have this European identity because I lived in Italy, I worked in Italy. Somehow part of me is Italian. I grew up and I was raised in Palestine, in East Jerusalem, but also I lived in America. And this is the first war where I had to be translating the words and the deeds of the Israelis to the Americans, to the Europeans, and yet they refuse to hear them. They refuse to hear the intention to dismantle and to annihilate Gaza and to exterminate Palestinians. For me, being in the Senate, the Italian Senate, I mean, like I was as you know, part of my story is challenging the far right in Italy, the fascist party. Part of my identity has been to push against the far right ethno-nationalism, racism, xenophobia, but also Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in this country. And I was sued by every member of this government, from Meloni to Salvini, her vice president, to to the vice president of the parliament. So to be in the Senate,
Mhm.
received with all the honors, but also by the opposition, that finally we have an opposition that can stand up to Meloni, led by women, remarkable senators,
Mhm.
women from every party, being there to, for the first time, not being intimidated by Meloni and her government, who are actually using and exploiting the accusation of anti-Semitism to intimidate, to silence, to censor people, and to prevent them from talking about genocide. But there's something more sinister. It's not only the talking about genocide, they don't want people to know that Italy is still selling weapons to
Mhm.
Israel. She said, oh, we stopped selling weapons and delivering weapons to Israel after uh, October 7th. Not only she was lying to the parliament, they were buying weapons, selling weapons, and also they were training pilots, Israeli pilots, who are dropping the weapons and the bombs on the heads of the children in Gaza that were being trained here in Italy. So in the Senate, finally, we have a real opposition that is calling out Meloni and demanding that Europe comply with its laws. Europe has on the books this, agreement, trade agreement with Israel. Article 2 of that agreement says any country that violates human rights, that use famine as a weapon of war, starvation as a weapon, that agreement is null and void. And yet Europe continued to, abide by the agreement, refuse to discuss the agreement or sanction Israel. And the current foreign minister in Europe, went to Israel 3 weeks ago, the day after we discovered that the Israeli army killed 15 paramedics. And she said, we are partners. So yet again, Europe is
Mhm.
finding itself on the wrong side of history, exactly like 80 years ago. So of my role, the role of this book is to awaken the Europeans and to invite and invoke and invite the opposition to stand up for what's right, not what's popular, for what's right.
Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to Zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
Rula, I've been looking at images from the book launch in Italy and seeing these senators holding up the book and seeing
Yeah.
the title projected. And I am really struck by the boldness of the title and the cover design. I was in Europe not long ago, and I was struck, even compared to North America, how much discomfort there still is with the word genocide being applied to
Yeah.
Israel among even supposedly progressive politicians, certainly in the dominant media. You made the title, huge block letters, breaking it down to its two elements. There it is, right? Geno, which means a race, a tribe, a people, and side, which means killing, the killing of an identifiable group of people in whole or in part, according to
Yes.
international law. And so, seeing these images and imagining it, lined up in bookstores, you're forcing the conversation to start right there. It's not just a book cover. It's really like it's an intervention. It's a
Yes.
poster. Tell me about this decision, which was clearly very deliberate.
Naomi, you sometimes you choose books. I wanted to write Miral. I
Mhm.
wanted to write my books about feminism. I wanted to write my novels about Christian minorities in Egypt. I wanted to write these books. This book chose me. It's the other way around. As if my life story suddenly became very relevant, but because it's part of what's the total destruction. So I was raised in this orphanage that was built after 48, after the first Nakba. My teacher, the woman who raised me, were the women who taught me about the Nakba. about the 500 villages that were destroyed, about the 700,000 Palestinians who were kicked out with violence, about one village after another. And they were the children who survived the massacre of Deir Yassin. So I remember them telling me, if it happened once, it can happen again. And I thought their trauma was speaking for them. I was wrong. Then I will never forget the second thing that in my life changed the way I view the world. And I was a child. I was an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and I woke up screaming in the middle, it was early in the morning, and I didn't understand what was happening. I ran towards the living room. My dad was standing there, my aunt, and another member of my family, the husband of my aunt, and they were all watching television. And it was a televised massacre of Sabra Shatila, 1982, in Lebanon, where Palestinian babies and children and women were lying in the floors of the streets. That was a dagger to our heart. That was a moment where we thought, I think as every Palestinian who watched those images was scarred, because we thought we might not be safe under military occupation, but somehow the Palestinians who are refugees are safe. And I just want to underscore how important Sabra Shatila in our psyche. The PLO decided to leave Lebanon, accepted to leave Lebanon. They basically, on one condition, and the condition was to safeguard the Palestinian civilians in Lebanon. And yet they were butchered and massacred. And I mean, I spoke as a journalist later on. I went to Lebanon. I went to that refugee camps. On the walls, there are still the names of the victims. Our memory is not written in history books. Our memories are written in refugee camps, on the walls, on the streets. The names of the victims are in our bloodstream, because we remember every moment of our history. We're even denied to tell the Western audience, when you talked about it all started October 7, for us, it's an ongoing Nakba that never ceased, that never stopped. And every time we're blamed for the political failure of the establishment. So I wrote this book because I wanted to write, as journalists were killed in Gaza, who were direct witness of the genocide, and doctors were, targeted, and they became direct witnesses to the genocide. I wrote this book because what's left with us, what's remain of us in this moment, to document this history, so never again can become a real promise, maybe not for the Palestinians, but for others.
I want to talk more about that childhood in the orphanage and how that shapes the way you always foreground kids. You always foreground children.
Yes.
You talk about the war on children, and you very early in the book you begin by describing being asked to translate the recorded cries for help from Hind. Ajab. Can you talk about how your own experience has shaped the way you've responded, the way you understand what is happening right now?
So my orphanage that still exists, by the way, in East Jerusalem, called Dar Tifel, the house of the child, house of the children. It was named for the children of Deir Yassin, but then it became the children of every massacre in Palestine. And our teacher, our mentor, Hind al-Husseini, her name is Hind. The woman that raised me, her name is Hind. Hind al-Husseini. And Hind taught us that our responsibility is to take care, if you were like, an older child would take care of the younger child. So the whole system was built on like a chain where the eldest took care of the youngest, and the youngest are taught how to take care of the youngest. So it was, and the only, she gave us a future, she gave us education, she gave us the freedom to, have opportunities in the world, because she basically got us scholarships so we could travel. But the promise we made to her, the pledge, was that we will, in our lifetime, whenever we have the possibilities, basically help other children, give them an education. She wanted to keep this incredible system where wherever you are, give scholarships, teach kids, do something about this. And she taught us this at a very early age, taking us to the refugee camps during the first Intifada. My job was to go to refugee camps to teach kids how to read and write.
And you write about this in the book.
But I was at CNN. I was invited actually by CNN to talk about another child who was killed in Chicago. That Palestinian child was 6 years old. He was stabbed 26 times. And I remember it shook me because we're not safe anywhere as Palestinians, including in Chicago. Even if you're an, Palestinian American, everywhere you're targeted. Because in the media system, but also in the Israeli system, they classify Palestinians as under three categories: Hamas, Hamas supporters, and human shield or potential terrorists. And thus, we're all are a legitimate, quote unquote, military target. But also, we became a target of all these fascists and also all the people that believe that we are directly and indirectly guilty of what Hamas did. Hind Rajab happened immediately after. And I remember a producer asked me if I could translate the words. And the first time I heard the words, it choked me. The voice, the cry for help, the voice that of a child that was terrorized, but also she was giving us all the elements, telling us there's a tank in front of us. I am in a car with my family who are killed. And then you can hear the shooting. Her sister, who was still alive when they started the call, died as we continued to listen to the call, but also the call of those paramedics to the army, giving them the coordinate of the car, telling them what was happening. And then the army authorized basically 2 paramedics. And then the whole, then there's a blackout. Then we discover that Hind was murdered with 335 bullets. 335 bullets, a child. And that's the moment where I decided that I need to write this book. For Hind, my mother, who raised me, for Hind, who died in Gaza, for Gaza that became its cemeteries for children. And also, I thought we need to safeguard this for future generations, not only of Palestinians, of every child around the world, of people of conscience, to make them understand what happens when there's no international protection, when there's no respect of international law, that a child is equivalent to a terrorist or a militant. A child is not a child anymore in the eyes of the powerful people, Israelis. And the incitement against children didn't start with Hind and October 7. It's a long history. I remember this T-shirt an Israeli soldier was wearing with a pregnant Palestinian woman saying, kill one, and then you shoot two, 1 for 2. And I was horrified by that T-shirt. But then I was in Israel visiting, once, and I saw 2 people wearing that T-shirt, total normal people walking, in Haifa, a mixed city. And then the way, I consume a lot of Israeli media, and the way I start listening to the way they talk about children, and minister after minister, including Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, who on multiple occasions said, we need to shoot the children, we need to shoot the pregnant mother, we need to erase their, like talking about erasing the future generation. And this is when you start realizing they were paving the way, they were preparing the country psychologically and mentally and emotionally through the propaganda to see Palestinian not as human beings, but as human animals. And
And
that
preparing the
didn't,
world, yeah.
and preparing the world.
Because you think about the students at Columbia
Yes.
who honored Hind, and the way they then are dehumanized and
Yes.
monsterized. I want to talk before we move on. I want to talk a little bit more about Europe, about Italy, about the significance of what's happening there. I'm speaking to you from Rome, and
Yes.
there's a particular power in launching the book in a country that fell to fascism under
Yes.
Mussolini, committed terrible crimes. And you write early in the book that Europe's horrific history of fascism and genocide, its attempt to exterminate Jews as a people in the 1940s, is inextricable from the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and from the Nakba, that these histories are tangled in this one kind of terrible knot because Europe tries to cleanse its guilt for genocide by
Yes.
offering blanket support to Israel and Zionism. And that requires the dehumanization of Palestinian, which then leads to the ongoing genocide now. You write, European crimes European crimes were made to be paid by a people who had not participated in those crimes at all, my people. So what you're doing now is you're educating Europeans about this other history that they don't learn in schools, that is not what they're hearing in the media. And what is it like to be doing this work? I mean, do you feel like something's cracking? Are you getting through?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And there's a divide between the public opinion and the establishment, Naomi.
Yeah.
And I mean by the establishment, political establishment and the media establishment. Just to be clear, not only governments are complicit. The Western media establishment created a consent, sadly, for genocide. But I want to go to the point of why Europe, why Italy. Italy has a fascist history, elected Mussolini. Mussolini deported Jews, passed racist racial laws to discriminate against them, which paved the way. But it all started with words. The way they described Jews in Europe in the 30s on, again, using language very similar to what the people in Rwanda, cockroaches, describing them as animals, like the worst kind of animals. So, to prepare the people to the mass killing. But Europe also, and especially Italy, which is fascinating. 3 years ago, this far-right government was elected. The first thing that Meloni said on national television, we shouldn't be ashamed of our own history. We should not be ashamed of our own history. It's the same words that J.D. Vance used in Europe when he came to Europe about people should not be ashamed. And I think Elon Musk used those words, exact same words. You shouldn't be ashamed. You should be ashamed of your own history. Your own history produced masculine destruction, millions of people. I mean, from the ashes of that history, we had incredible things, the genocide conventions, the tribunals, and many other, treaties and laws that supposed to protect all of us, right? And then they created Israel. And because of their guilt, they allowed Israel to violate every law on the book, every treaty, every convention. In my book, I write the story of the first time Israel started violating that, which is the right to return. And that is a crucial moment for the Israelis to start understanding that they can act with total impunity. Israel had,
Well, you're right about
they,
the assassination of.
yes,
Maybe tell that story because it's not that known. I don't think, but you're
yeah,
tracing that the attack on international law is
yes.
not new, and that's so key.
And it started immediately. So after the establishment of the state of Israel, after they kicked out, ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians, the UN appoint this envoy, an important man, Bernadotte, Lord Bernadotte, and he goes there. And this guy actually is very pro-Israel.
A
And
Swedish diplomat.
a Swedish diplomat. During the Holocaust, he actually many times helped Jewish children to save them. He is a well-respected. Israel accept him. And then immediately, as soon as he arrives and sees the villages and see the crisis of, the Palestinians who are kicked out to other countries, he then realized that they need to address this issue immediately at the offset. And then he started lobbying the Israelis, telling them, you really need to address this wrongdoing. And the only way to do it is basically integrate and take back the Palestinians. I think he after the declaration of independence of Israel that talked about equal rights of all inhabitants of the land, regardless ethnicity, etc. He didn't realize that Doha's declaration was made to the Western world just to appease to them, tell them, we're really a Western democracy, we're very similar to you. We're not going to be an ethno-nationalist. So Bernadotte believed in that, myth, and goes to the United Nations, to other countries, and start advocating for Palestinian rights. They kill him. They assassinate the Swedish envoy of the United Nations,
Who was trying to enforce the right of return.
who was trying to enforce. They kill him, assassinate, and then there was never real accountability for that act. The United Nations, instead of holding Israel accountable for the murder of one of its important representative, they basically create UNRWA to deal with the refugees as a mechanism. It's like, well, we cannot. Israel doesn't want them to return. So instead of enforcing the laws that, and the resolutions, the United Nations resolution, but also every law says, law of war says, refugees go back home after a war. What they do is they bypass the law by creating basically UNRWA, which is an agency that the Israeli government now outlawed many years after. But this process of dismantling UNRWA, the United Nations representative, but also institution, but also their war on the UN and international law started from the beginning, from 1948, immediately after they established a state, and they were never held accountable. The crimes we see today in Gaza, the genocide we see today in Gaza, there's a long walk towards that genocide, and it was made by multiple episodes where Israel was allowed to violate the laws, to murder, to assassinate Palestinians, and also international diplomats, envoys, to basically walk all over, international law with the protection of Western countries. And when I talk about this with the Italians, and yesterday one of the senators who was there, he was, he was very moved, and he said something. He said, it's very hard for us to admit that the victims of basically the grandchildren of the victim of a genocide are committing a genocide. It's very hard for us to understand that we failed twice over.
So I want to talk more about UNRWA. You have direct experience. You talk about how when you were growing up in the orphanage that it helped you imagine a future. Can you talk more about what that meant?
So when I, our orphanage was built by this woman, but we needed external help, right? So we relied on international institutions, governments, other people that basically would support these children, whether it's you donate books, you donate clothing, you donate anything. But we relied on our mainly and for healthcare. So we would have, to go to the hospitals or vaccine or other things. And we're thousands of girls, thousands of orphans in this place. And I think one of the things that was always incredible, these dedicated professionals, and I would see them also in the refugee camps teaching kids. Like every school in Palestine is basically run by UNRWA. So they are giving you healthcare, they're giving you food, but also they're giving you education, which is the only window, Naomi, to having an opportunity and a little bit of, future. And I remember the books I would find in these refugee camps where I would go teach these kids to read and write. I mean, the first time I read about Europe, because one of these UNRWA, basically employees gave me a book that I love. It's Primo Levi's book, If This Is a Man. The first time I read any book about Europe. Or Dante. I mean, I didn't know who Dante was, but she was Italian. And they would come and basically she opened my horizons about this other world that directly impacted my homeland and the history of my home. So she actually was telling me, you need to read Europe's history and to understand your own history. And then UNRWA with time became the only thing that was giving Palestinian a sustainable future. I mean, I have friends, colleagues who are working in hospital run by UNRWA. I have people who were saved on UNRWA. But the most important thing for me was education. And the fact that UNRWA, for many generations, educated children. And that's what made a huge difference. Palestinians are the most educated people in the Middle East, thanks to UNRWA. The most educated, but also our parents couldn't give us anything except a degree, graduation, and education. They wouldn't, they don't have homes or lands so we could inherit, because the Israelis can take that anytime. They could not take our ability to think freely and to process, the information we have, or our ability to narrate our story. And that, I think, UNRWA played a major role in it. There is moments I remember in these especially refugee camps, or even in Israel, somewhere they have clinics where women came from very poor background. And I remember in the orphanage, I would see some of these mothers who would leave their children because they didn't have food. so they would leave their children. But I remember one of the mothers didn't have a leg, and she would go to the UNRWA, so they would give her the plastic leg that she could, and also they would help her with those 4 children that she had, and she really was living in one bedroom in East Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. I mean, there was a family that was living in a cave, literally a cave in East Jerusalem, very close to Dar Tifel orphanage. And if it wasn't for UNRWA, these children would have been lost. So UNRWA played a major role, but UNRWA was viewed as the Israelis as perpetrating the myth of the right of return. They were not perpetrating any myth. They were actually trying to help Israel to guarantee services. Otherwise, Israel would have to provide for the Palestinians, because as an occupying power, they have a legal responsibility to do it. Actually, there's a letter that Israeli government drafted to UNRWA after 1967 saying, yes, please take care of these services. So now, fast forward, we see Israeli officials and many writing that UNRWA is the enemy. UNRWA is a terrorist organization. UNRWA should be banned. And they banned it. This is the first time any country in the world banned a UN agency. And yet, we live in an era where they can do it. The leader of the country that did it, which is the Prime Minister Netanyahu, can come to Congress and receive 58 standing ovation, while UNRWA is now banned completely. Their facilities are destroyed in Gaza. Their employees are murdered, and nothing happens.
And Israel is stepping in to supply what it's calling aid in the most horrific manner, which maybe we can come back to. But there's a reason why the perpetrators of the crime are not the ones who are providing humanitarian aid, because of course they cannot be trusted, because they're the ones who've just committed the crime. So you write about Trump's recent executive order which withdrew the US from UNRWA. You say that this sent a clear message to the world that they no longer believe in a system of international legality as they don't believe in international humanitarian law, that it should apply to war. What do you say to people who say this never existed in the first place, right? Because this is really at the core of your book, right? That we know that international humanitarian law was compromised from the beginning. As you've been arguing right now, there was always the exception made for Israel. But should we conclude from this that we throw the whole thing out, or is there some kind of possibility that maybe even because of Trump, because he is declaring economic war on so many allies, that there could be a strengthening of this international infrastructure, almost in the absence of the U.S., who has been such a compromising power from the beginning?
I think it's a great point, and it's a great question, Naomi, because I think many countries took for granted international law, literally took for granted. Something I mentioned in the book, how the shamefulness of the Republican Party. After the International Criminal Court issued the arrest warrants, Karim Khan, the prosecutor, received a phone call from a senator, U.S. senator, who told him the court is not made for the US and its ally. It's made for Africa and for thugs like Putin. And I think that was the verbalization of, we don't really believe the law is for us. The law is for those other people, for those, people in Africa, Black people, or thugs like Putin who we don't like. But
they actually like him now, and they're not applying it to him either. So yeah,
exactly. That was before Trump got elected. And then I think many people, especially progressives, realize that what they took for granted is actually a system that was collapsing, that Gaza became a cemetery for international law. So they needed to step in. And I think this is the moment where they start defending not only Palestinians, they start defending their own survival. Because what we're seeing is humanity and international law are being buried in Gaza, literally. And I think they decided to rise up. Obviously in the beginning they were very shy about it, but Gaza became a mirror, and I think became something very clear that this is the future that you might find everywhere else. This is the globalization of Gaza. of the gazification of the global order. And I think this is what scared them the most. And they realized that when Israel started bombing across the Middle East, they start basically bashing European leaders who criticized them in a way that was truly very thuggish. But this did not start, again, it's not a recent thing. The former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Ben Suta, was threatened by Israel, by the head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, who told her, don't investigate Israel because something really bad could happen to you and to your family. I mean, that brazen act continued to happen, but it was not public domain. It was not known. Now everything is known. We live in an aquarium. Everything is seen and heard and known. Nobody can say we did not know. And I think the action that we will take today will decide if Gaza become the future model to export globally or will become the defining model where international law is strengthened. You and I talked about the role of Democrats in America, how they abandoned that role and they were punished during the elections. I think Europe, and what I saw in Canada in a different way, Australia, but Europe has this awakening, wake up call now. And I see that the first time, the threat of being accused of anti-Semitism is not working anymore. But also the threat of being bullied or harassed on others doesn't work anymore. The public opinion, the overwhelming majority of Italians, almost 80%, think Israel is committing genocide and want it to be sanctioned. 80%. This is a country that produced Mussolini. So the reaction to Mussolini, not, let's embrace the other Mussolinis in Israel. The reaction to Mussolini, let's protect international law and let's sanction Israel. Naomi, I wrote many books in Italian. This is my 6th book. None of my presentation I had like maybe 10 people attending. I'm lucky, especially when I talk about feminism and women's rights. They don't want to hear about it. This book, I was in a theater in Florence last week. I was stunned. There was 300 people inside the theater and people couldn't come in. They were waiting outside, but because of security measure, we couldn't allow them. My book became bestseller after only 3 weeks. I am shocked, but it's not me. People are outraged. I think it's a tool for people to express their outrage at the failure of the political system, the failure of their political class. And I mentioned also Aaron Bushnet, who burned himself in front of the US embassy. And he said, this is what our ruling class decide that will be normal. And I think people here decided, we don't want to normalize this. We will oppose this by any means.
And does the fact that the far right parties in Europe, including in Italy, are so closely aligned with Israel, is that starting to reveal that there's no redemption for Europe there, right? I mean, this is a continuation of fascism.
Absolutely. And the most stunning part, I was on a TV show last week, and a right-winger, a real right-winger who through the years we debated many times, and he always attacked me on women's rights, on Trump, on Milan, always. And last week he said, this is the first time I'm going to say this. I agree with Rula Jebreal. And I was like stunned. I thought I was about to, I wanted him to say it again, and he said it twice on a public TV show, on a channel owned by the offsprings of Berlusconi.
That's like Piers Morgan agreeing with Mehdi. I mean, what's happening?
This is like Tucker Carlson agreeing with Mehdi Hassan. It's even more. And so something is changing even in the far right. Because even the far right, the European far right of today, the leadership agree with Israel, partner with ever, and they continue to sell weapons. But there's a division. There's a faction very similar to America First, who they don't agree because they see this as a potential, that can expand the war to other countries. They don't want wars anymore. They don't want, they really hated the war on terrorists. They hated the amount of money that was spent on the war on terrorists. They hated what it did to them and to those countries, especially, just to be clear, especially the issue of refugees. And many of them were telling me, I was like, what Israel is doing will create more refugees. We don't want refugees, so we need to stop Israel now. And whatever reasons, fine with me. But the fact that for the first time, and one of these far rights, not only politicians, journalists told me last week, he said, what was the turning point for the Holocaust, for Europeans to understand, when we start seeing images of women and children. And he said to me, your book is about children, protection of children mainly, and civilians. And he said that when he read the story of Hind Rajab, this is the moment when he realized that this is not a normal war, that this is really a genocide. When he read the testimony of Mark Bermutter, apologies, let me repeat his name, Mark Bermutter, who was this US medic, a Jewish man who went to Gaza, served in Gaza for 6 months, and he testified on multiple occasions, even to 60 Minutes, that he saw soldiers, snipers shooting children in the head and in the heart, that he operated on pregnant women that were 7 months pregnant, and saw that where their pelvis was obliterated and the baby, basically the fetus, was killed inside of her womb, that he was the first one to say, the best snipers in the world don't kill a child with 2 bullets twice. So they're doing it deliberately. He was with me yesterday at the Senate when we testified before the Senate. And he repeated that they should not accept the charge of anti-Semitism from Meloni and from the fascists in Europe and from Netanyahu, because what they're trying to do is to create a cover for this genocide. They're weaponizing anti-Semitism to justify genocide. Those are his words. And I think something is changing because of these voices, and also especially because of the children.
So much of this is about fear, right? Like people,
Yes.
I think they do know it, but they're afraid. And you write about this in the book. They're afraid of they're afraid of professional consequences. They're afraid of the accusations, but they're also afraid of the power behind the accusations, right?
Yes.
So that's really about creating a counterpower, right? That also is able to exact a cost, right? And I do think there is some fear now that of actually being on the wrong side of history, and there being consequences for being on, and we're even seeing this from Israeli politicians coming forward and trying to get on the right side, and there's fear in that, right? But I want to talk more about the media, because this is a big part of your book as well, as a journalist, and you're telling stories that from the inside, from your own experience of those professional consequences of telling the truth, of friends, colleagues of yours who lost shows, lost jobs for telling the truth. And there is a way that Israel cracks open so many of the other crises within our democracy, within our media, because when the journalists say the truth, often it's the owners that come forward, right? So this becomes an issue of media democracy. And so what is your message to other journalists? Is it that if there's enough of us talking about it, that they can't fire everyone? I mean, how do we make these cracks real openings that stay open, and that we don't just revert back to the censorship, because it's contested still?
Yes. Look, I mean, I don't want to remind them of 230 Palestinian journalists who died, were killed, hunted down and killed, just to give us a glimpse of what's happening in Gaza, to show us they were the bravest human beings, heroes, who showed us, who are witnesses to the genocide, and they would rush and run to the scenes of the massacres, knowing that they would unleash drones and many of them will be killed. And they were killed specifically because wearing the vest where it's written press. When Jamal Khashoggi was killed, our media wrote these amazing op-eds saying, democracy dies in darkness. No, democracy actually dies also in daylight, and dies in newsrooms, when you decide that journalists are not allowed to use words like genocide, ethnic cleansing, when you start censoring the language of the reality, when you start criminalizing anyone that is trying to open the window and show you the truth, when you put on air people who justify the genocide day in and day out, as if your role is to give them a microphone, instead of your role actually to examine the charge, the talking point, and then go out and verify and and confront those talking points with the reality that you saw. So if you don't want to be a tool in the system of genocide, you need to do your job. All we're asking you, we're not asking you to sympathize with Palestinians or to have compassion or to believe in anything. We're asking you to do your job. And the simple job is, when somebody is lying, like the Israel has been proven to lie many times over, then everything that they say needed to be vetted before you air it, and you need to confront them on their lies. The 40 beheaded babies, that lie led to the mass murder of thousands of children. That lie was debunked by Israeli reporters and journalists, thank God. But none in the US media ever were held accountable for that. I mean, many times I watched German media, or the way some of the Italian media were talking about the genocide, or the American media, and I thought, this is Radio Rwanda all over again. Direct incitement to genocide. 2 days ago, exact 2 days ago, in the Italian media, somebody was justifying the mass murder of children and saying, well, they're potential terrorists in the future. This is the way Israel thinks. They're traumatized before October 7th. They're not really killing them intentionally. Somebody in France saying they're not really killing children intentionally. I mean, we have ample evidence they are doing it. You have testimony and witnesses. We have the kind of weapons. We have, we have pictures. We have videos. How many need to die in that atrocious way for you to start doing your job? And for me, it's not that we need to help them do it. We need to shame them into doing it. But also, I hope somebody will start suing some of the media that put out a lot of these claims, and some of the media that continue to dehumanize and criminalize collectively Palestinians, because those people need to be held accountable. I was watching an Italian television, and the former spokesperson of Meloni said on air, on national television, without being contested, that Israel should wipe out all of Gaza. And not only that, need to do what the Allies did in Dresden and Dresden. And I thought,
which
this is a war crime.
Which is why we have the Geneva
Thank you.
Conventions, literally.
And nobody contested them. No one contested them. Nobody said, well, wait 1 second, you're actually endorsing war crimes. And that's why we have the laws, and we have we have all. So again, I think we've seen the level, or other journalists, serious one, who start talking about when 15,000 children were already killed in Gaza. And I remember somebody at CNN said, well, at least they were not raped. And I keep thinking about that sentence. What is she trying to say? At least they were murdered, but at least they were not raped. How is that is not dehumanizing an entire group of children, of people, and is justified for this person to still be on air and continue to be on air? I mean, for me, it's unfathomable.
So we need viewers to say this is not acceptable,
Exactly. And also we need, and I admire the people who can go on these TV shows and debunk these liars and propagandists. It's very hard. I mean, I did it a couple of times. You do it.
No,
but believe me, it's draining. I mean, every time I leave, I want to throw up. I don't know how Mehdi does it. I don't know whatever yoga he does, we all need to do that. But I think it's very important, because you go there, we debunk that with facts. But every time I was called a Hamas supporter, I mean, like on CNN, and I was screamed at, and I never in my life had a man screaming at me on a national television except that time. And that was on CNN. He was a paid contributor, and they raised his fees. They basically give him more money because he screamed at women of color and Palestinian women who try to tell the truth.
But you write about this in the book as well, going back to the release of your film Miral, which is a beautiful film. It shows diversity of opinion in the Palestinian community. It humanizes the Palestinian experience, and people tried to barred screening, Israel supporters at the
Yeah.
UN tried to
Yes.
keep it from being screened. So the threat is the humanization, right? It's
Yes.
not that
Yes.
it's not that you're any of the things you're being accused of. It's the opposite, right? It's that people,
Yes.
if they see you, if they hear you, they'll connect with you. If they see or hear directly from Palestinians in Gaza, that humanizes, and that is the threat.
Yes.
So that's what we really have to get at, and that's what your book does so well in telling these stories. I think it's going to make a huge difference, Rula.
But you inspired it, Naomi. Just to be clear, I attended that incredible Passover. I heard your amazing prayer that was so important and truly made me understand that this genocide, the difference of people supporting it are not left or right. The division is not left or it's humanist versus the people who really believe in an era or in a world order where the protection don't apply to people like myself who look like me. I remember
supremacist
exactly
worldview, yes.
supremacist, fascist, but also people who liberal, but think that the liberal order is for liberals and not for those others, whatever they want to call them. So the colonization is a mindset.
Mhm.
It's not even geographically or a political you know ideology. It's a mindset, it's a cultural thing, and many people even in our camp believe that the West can do whatever they want and their allies outside the borders. Inside the borders, Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party will protect and defend somehow,
Mhm.
whatever but then they think that outside other rules should apply because it's a jungle. And they don't understand this is how you pave the way to fascism. But when we talk about the humanization, you know, allies like you saw me and people like me as a human being, and that is so empowering. And not only that, it was so uplifting. The support throughout these 20 months of genocide, that what kept many in my community, that's what made us survive this genocide. Because then you gave us the fuel, the power, so we can
Well,
narrate.
Rula, I think it's the other way around, first of all. But I want to ask you about any advice you might have, because I know you've thought a lot about this, about how we could keep going, right? I mean, and how we adapt, how we change, because the terrain on which we're organizing and speaking is changing all the time, right?
Yes.
I speak to a lot of people who express this feeling that I think is understandable, that words don't mean anything anymore. What is the point? We've tried, it's failed. But I think what you're doing shows that that's a luxury that we can't afford. And that words do matter, right? I
Of
mean,
course, of
and,
course.
and if they didn't matter, why would people get so angry about a word like genocide, about a word like
Yes.
apartheid? Why would Palestinians in Gaza be risking everything to get messages, images out if it didn't matter? Why would Israel work so hard to try to contain the discourse? Um, so what do you think we need to do going forward? Like, how do we keep going? How do we learn lessons from the past? How do we break this cycle of
Yeah.
trauma being passed from one group to the next? I mean, these are huge questions, but I know you do have
Yeah.
some advice.
Yeah.
So before we lose you,
Yeah.
you're next.
Listen, for me, one of the most important things that our coalition, this large, beautiful, multi-ethnic, multiracial, young, older, of all, need to be much more united, even in our own differences, but also not waste energy on debating each other or proving each other wrong. The moment is a crisis, as an existential crisis for all of us. So when I see people, honestly, I don't waste any more time because I know the enemy is very united to exterminate all of us and to eradicate even our presence. They're burning books in America. I'll, you cannot read certain books in certain schools. And so when this moment happens, whether it's, you see fascism creeping inside societies everywhere, and the model of that Gaza is becoming now, a global model, we need to be much more united, but also The power of words is so important that the Israeli government is now putting hundreds of millions of dollars into propaganda because they know they lost the narrative. And they lost it because this global amazing effort led by Palestinians, but not only, there's a huge allies that basically continue in every language, in every channel. I have women, a chef the other day was reading passage of my book. She's a prominent chef in Italy. She has a restaurant. She was reading, why would a chef would read passages and upload, a video of herself reading about the famine in Gaza, the starvation in Gaza. There's a TV host who's hosting, Isola dei Famosi, they call it. It's like a reality TV show where people go to these islands. And like, I never watched that, but she uploaded a video of herself talking about the famine in Gaza. And I'm thinking about why Gaza is touching all of this humanity, because this actually need to make us understand this moment where they're calling for us to be more responsible and much more active and much more organized and mobilized. But also whoever wants, I think, should jump into politics. I don't believe in any politicians anymore. I think they are all compromised in a way or another, but we need people who actually have these ethic principles. I know it will be hard work for a lot of people, but if you can dedicate 2 years or 4 years of your life to be in the powerful rooms, that voice that is out there need to be in these rooms and need to challenge these people. We need to kill the echo chamber, because we need to bring that conversation inside these rooms to make them understand that in what happened in these rooms will decide what future we will have as a collective humanity. And I think this is the best way. But also we need to support the people who are elected. Rashida Tlaib is like censored and attacked. And we need really to create this network of support, because all of us are in this boat together. And if this boat sinks, it's over. But we can never allow it to sink. So that's my only,
That's
2 cents
amazing.
advice.
Amazing advice, Rula. Thank you so much for staying up late in Rome and talking to us. Huge congratulations again on this incredible book that is already changing the world. And I can't wait for it to come out in English. And yeah, thank you all for tuning into another episode of Unshocked.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.